The rain fell like a punishment from heaven, each drop a cold needle against Lady Eleanora Ashford's skin as she fled through the darkness, her wedding gown, that magnificent prison of ivory, silk and seed pearls, now heavy as a shroud, dragging through mud and bracken as she ran. Behind her, somewhere in the storm-shrouded distance, lay the great house where her wedding feast continued without its bride, where Lord Blackmore, 63 years old, with hands like pale spiders and breath that smelled of decay, had excused himself to find his new wife and claim what the church had granted him. She had seen it in his eyes during the ceremony, that proprietary hunger, and something within her had simply shattered some final desperate fragment of hope that had whispered perhaps it would not be so terrible, perhaps she could endure. But when he had leaned close during their first dance, his papery lips brushing her ear as he described what he intended for their wedding night, Eleanora had understood with crystalline clarity that endurance was not survival, and survival required flight. So she had murmured an excuse about freshening herself, slipped through the servants' corridors she had memorized in the weeks of her imprisonment, called an engagement, and vanished into the storm like a ghost returning to the grave. Now the forest swallowed her, ancient oaks twisting overhead like gnarled fingers, their branches catching at her veil until she tore it free and let it drift away into the darkness, a white flag of surrender she refused to carry. Her slippers had been lost miles ago, and her feet bled against stones and roots, but still she pressed forward, driven by a terror that transcended pain. Asterisk. Better to die in the wilderness, asterisk, she thought. Asterisk than to live as his possession, asterisk. The lightning cracked across the sky like divine judgment, and in its brief, brilliant illumination, she saw them gates of black iron rising from the mist, impossibly tall, wrought with thorns and roses that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. Beyond them, a castle emerged from the darkness, all towers and shadows and windows like hollow eyes, a structure that seemed less built than grown from the very bones of the earth. Local legend whispered of this place, Thornwood Castle, abandoned for years, haunted by tragedy and inhabited only by ghosts. The villagers crossed themselves when they passed its boundaries, spoke of a beast that dwelt within, a monster born of fire and grief. Eleanora's hand trembled as she reached for the gate, knowing she should turn back, should seek shelter elsewhere, should fear whatever darkness dwelt within those walls. But the rain drove harder, and behind her she could almost hear the baying of hounds, the thunder of hooves, the voice of Lord Blackmore calling for his bride. Her fingers touched the cold iron, and the gate swung open before her. Silent as a sigh, welcoming as an embrace, she did not allow herself to hesitate. Lady Eleanora Ashford, daughter of a ruined earl, bride of a monster in gentleman's clothing, stepped across the threshold of Thornwood Castle and felt the gates close behind her with the finality of a tomb sealing shut. She did not yet know that she had merely exchanged one prison for another, that the master of this dark sanctuary had rules of his own, or that some cages, in time, might come to feel like home. She knew only that she was out of the rain, beyond Blackmore's reach, and for this single, precious moment, free. The great hall of Thornwood Castle stretched before her like a cathedral of shadows, its vaulted ceiling lost in darkness, its walls lined with armor that gleamed dully in the flickering light of torches that seemed to burn without warmth. Eleanora stood in a spreading pool of rainwater, her ruined gown dripping onto flagstones that had not felt the touch of gentle feet in years, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she tried to comprehend the enormity of the space around her. And then she heard it, a footstep, heavy and deliberate, descending from the grand staircase that curved into the darkness like a serpent's spine. "You are trespassing." The voice came before the man, deep as thunder rolling across distant hills, cold as the iron gates that had welcomed her into this forsaken place. Eleanora's heart seized in her chest as the figure emerged from shadow into the guttering torchlight, and she understood at once why the villagers whispered of beasts and monsters, why they crossed themselves and hurried past these grounds with eyes averted. Duke Sebastian Vane stood before her, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb the light around him. But it was his face that commanded her attention, or rather, what remained of it. The right side bore the ghost of what must have been striking handsomeness, a strong jaw and high cheekbone, an eye of piercing grey that held intelligence and something darker, something wounded. But the left side told a different story entirely, a tapestry of scarred tissue that twisted from his temple to his jaw, pulling at his lip, destroying his eyebrow, leaving the flesh mottled and rippled like wax that had melted and reformed into something terrible. His left eye, though intact, sat within a cage of damaged skin, and when he stepped closer, Eleanora saw that the scarring continued down his neck, disappearing beneath his collar, suggesting horrors that extended far beyond what was visible. I sought shelter from the storm, she managed, her voice emerging as barely a whisper, and she hated herself for the tremor in it, hated that after everything she had endured, after the courage it had taken to flee, she could still be reduced to trembling by a scarred face and a commanding presence. I meant no intrusion. I will leave at first light. You will not. He descended the final steps, each footfall echoing like a pronouncement of doom, and stood before her with his hands clasped behind his back, examining her as one might examine an insect that had wandered into one's study. Those who enter Thornwood do not leave. That is my law, the only law that matters within these walls. His grey gaze travelled over her sodden wedding gown, her bare and bleeding feet, the wild tangle of her dark hair from which she had torn her veil, and something flickered in his expression, recognition, perhaps, or understanding. You are running from something, someone. The gown speaks of a wedding, but the terror in your eyes speaks of escape rather than celebration. Eleanora lifted her chin, summoning what dignity remained, to a woman who stood shivering in a stranger's hall in a ruined dress. My circumstances are my own concern. Your circumstances became my concern the moment you crossed my threshold. He turned away from her, moving toward the massive fireplace where embers still glowed. I am Sebastian Vane, Duke of Thornwood, though the world believes me dead, and I intend to keep it that way. You have stumbled into a tomb, Lady Bride, and tombs do not release their occupants. You will remain here, hidden from whatever demon you flee, and in exchange, you will speak of this place to no one. Those are my terms. Asterisk, a prison asterisk, Eleanora thought, staring at his scarred profile in the firelight. Asterisk, I have escaped one monster only to find another asterisk, but even as the thought formed, she noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the mantle, how his voice, though commanding, carried an undertone of something that sounded almost like loneliness, and she wondered, with the first stirring of curiosity that had penetrated her fear, what manner of beast this truly was. The fire crackled in the hearth as Sebastian Vane studied her with those mismatched eyes, one framed by unmarred skin, the other peering from a cage of ruined flesh, and Eleanora felt herself weighed and measured in that gaze, catalogued and categorized, like one of the dusty specimens she imagined might fill the forgotten corners of this mausoleum he called home. You require sanctuary, he said at last, the words falling like stones into still water, and I require assurance that my existence remains unknown to the world beyond these walls, that the dead stay buried, so to speak. He turned from the fireplace, and she watched the way the flames cast dancing shadows across his scars, transforming them moment by moment from terrible to almost beautiful in their testament to survival. I propose an arrangement, Lady Bride. You will remain at Thornwood as my housekeeper, a position of employment, nothing more, nothing less. You will oversee what little domestic order exists within these walls, and in exchange, you will have shelter, sustenance, and protection from whatever horror you fled in that ruined gown. Your fiancé, I presume, given the way you flinch at the word wedding. Eleanora's chin lifted once more, that stubborn pride her father had tried so desperately to break, the same pride that had carried her through storm and darkness to this unlikely refuge. Lord Blackmore is not a man easily discouraged. He will search for me. He will come with constables and accusations, with claims of lawful ownership. Let him come. The words were quiet, but they carried a weight that silenced her protest, a certainty that spoke of a man who had faced far worse than angry suitors and legal proceedings. These walls have kept out greater threats than aging lords with wounded vanity. You will be safe here, so long as you abide by my conditions. He moved toward her then, and she forced herself not to retreat, not to show the fear that still flickered at the edges of her courage. You will be given the west wing for your private quarters, comfortable rooms, I am told, though I confess I have not entered them in years. You will have freedom to explore most of the castle and grounds, with one exception. The East Tower is forbidden. You will not approach it. You will not ask questions about it. You will not so much as glance toward it with curiosity in your eyes. That portion of Thornwood belongs to the dead, and I will not have it disturbed. Asterisk, what tragedy lives in that tower, asterisk, she wondered. Asterisk, what ghosts does he keep locked away? Asterisk, but she recognized the raw edge beneath his commanding tone, the grief that sharpened each word like a blade, and she understood that some wounds were too fresh for prodding, even years after their infliction. And if I wished to leave, she asked, knowing already what his answer would be, knowing that she was trading one form of captivity for another, yet finding herself strangely less afraid of this gilded cage than of the iron shackles Blackmore represented. You will not. His answer was absolute. Those who enter Thornwood remain. That is my law, and it is not negotiable. But consider, Lady Bride, and here something almost like dark humor flickered across his features, is a prison, truly a prison, if it protects you from something worse beyond its walls? Is a cage truly a cage if the door locks from the inside? Eleanora looked at this scarred, isolated man who spoke of imprisonment while offering sanctuary, this beast who demanded her captivity while promising her safety, and she made her choice the only choice available to a woman with nothing left to lose. I accept your terms, Your Grace, she said, and did not miss the brief flash of something surprise, perhaps, or relief, that crossed his ruined face before the mask of cold authority descended once more. Then welcome to Thornwood, Lady Eleanora, he replied, and her name on his lips felt like both a blessing and a binding, a spell that would hold her to this place and this man for reasons she could not yet fathom. May you find it more hospitable than it appears. The days that followed her arrival at Thornwood unfolded like pages of a book written in dust and shadow. Each room Eleanora explored, revealing new chapters of a story she was only beginning to understand, a story of grief so profound it had frozen an entire castle in amber, preserving a moment of tragedy that refused to release its grip on the present. She wandered the West Wing first, familiarizing herself with the quarters that would serve as her sanctuary within a sanctuary, finding them surprisingly beautiful beneath their shroud of neglect. A sitting room with windows that faced the overgrown gardens, a bedchamber with a canopied bed draped in faded blue velvet, a small dressing room that still held the ghost scent of lavender sachets long since crumbled to powder. But it was when she ventured beyond her designated domain that the true nature of her prison revealed itself, each corridor a testament to interrupted life, to happiness severed at the root. She discovered a nursery first, tucked away in the north wing behind a door that protested her intrusion with a mournful creak, and stood breathless on the threshold as morning light filtered through grimy windows to illuminate a room preserved in heartbreaking detail. A rocking horse with a faded mane, a shelf of picture books with worn spines, a small bed still made with coverlets embroidered with dancing rabbits, a doll seated in a miniature chair as though waiting for her mistress to return. Dust lay thick upon every surface, undisturbed for years, and Eleanora felt like an intruder in a sacred space, a trespasser in a shrine to loss she could not yet comprehend. The music room came next, its grand piano shrouded in white cloth like a spectre at rest, its walls lined with instruments that had not felt the touch of human hands since when, she wondered, since the fire that had marked the Duke's flesh and, she was beginning to understand, his very soul. Every portrait in the castle had been turned to face the walls, a peculiar and unsettling detail she noticed as she moved from room to room, as though Sebastian Vane could not bear the gaze of his ancestors, could not endure the painted eyes that watched from their gilded frames. It was Mrs. Finch who found her standing before one such reversed portrait, the elderly housekeeper who had served Thornwood for 40 years and who now moved through its halls like a ghost herself, silent and sorrowful and fiercely protective of the master who had retreated into his isolation like a wounded animal seeking darkness in which to die. "Best not to disturb those, my lady," she said softly, her lined face kind despite the warning in her words. "The Duke has his reasons, painful though they be. There was a time when this house rang with laughter, when the gardens bloomed and music filled these halls, but that was before the fire, before we lost the Duchess and little Lady Catherine. He blames himself, you see, though it was none of his doing, and the grief has eaten at him until naught remains but the anger and the solitude. The groundskeeper, Thomas, encountered later that afternoon as Eleonora surveyed the tangled wilderness that had once been formal gardens, proved equally forthcoming, his weathered hands stilling on his rake as he spoke of the master who had once been golden, who had loved his wife and daughter with a devotion that had seemed unbreakable until the night it shattered entirely, leaving only the beast behind. The first battle came on the third evening of her residence at Thornwood, when Mrs. Finch appeared at Eleonora's chamber door, bearing a silver tray laden with covered dishes, her expression apologetic as she explained that His Grace had ordered all meals delivered to the ladies' rooms, that she was not expected, not permitted, the unspoken word hung between them, to dine in the great hall where the master took his solitary suppers. Eleonora studied the tray with its fine china and carefully arranged silver, studied the steam rising from beneath the domed covers, and felt something ignite within her chest that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the stubborn flame that had carried her through storm and darkness to this place. "Please inform His Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart, "that I did not escape one prison to become a ghost in another, and that if he wishes me to fulfill my duties as housekeeper of this establishment, I will require meals at a proper table like a living person, rather than scraps delivered to my cage like a kept animal." Mrs. Finch's eyes widened, something that might have been admiration flickering in their depths before she hurried away to deliver this declaration of war, and Eleonora waited in her chamber with hands clasped tightly together, wondering if she had just secured her expulsion from the only sanctuary available to her, or something worse, something involving the beast's rumored temper, and those scars that spoke of violence survived, if not necessarily violence abjured. The summons came within the hour, a terse message delivered by a visibly nervous Mrs. Finch that Lady Eleonora was expected in the dining hall at 8 o'clock precisely, and that His Grace trusted she would find the arrangements satisfactory even if he did not find them comfortable. The dining hall, when she entered it that evening wearing the least damaged of the gowns Mrs. Finch had procured from some forgotten wardrobe, proved to be a cavernous space of shadows and candlelight, its long table set for two at opposite ends, like generals preparing for negotiation across a battlefield. Sebastian sat at the head, his scarred face illuminated by the candelabra before him, and he did not rise as she entered, did not offer greeting or acknowledgement, merely watched her with those mismatched eyes as she made her way to the distant place setting and seated herself with all the dignity she could muster. They ate in silence that first night, and the second, and the third. The clink of silver against porcelain, the only conversation between them, the vast length of polished mahogany stretching like a declaration of the distance he intended to maintain. But Eleonora, watching him from beneath lowered lashes, as she had learned to watch men during her years of navigating ballrooms and drawing rooms filled with predators in fine clothing, noticed something that softened the edges of her resentment. He never lifted his fork until she had taken her first bite, never touched his wine until she had sipped from her own glass. A courtesy so ingrained, so automatic, that she suspected he did not even realize he performed it. Asterisk, the beast remembers his manners, asterisk, she thought. Asterisk somewhere beneath the growling and the glowering, the gentleman remains, asterisk, and she wondered what other fragments of the man he had been might still survive within the fortress of his isolation, waiting to be discovered by someone patient enough to look. Weeks passed in the strange suspended rhythm of Thornwood, each day bleeding into the next like watercolors on wet paper, until Eleonora found she could no longer remember precisely how long she had been a resident of this shadow-haunted place. 3 weeks, perhaps 4, time measured not in calendar pages but in small victories and subtle shifts, in dinners where the silence grew less hostile and more companionable, in mornings where she caught Sebastian watching her from across the great hall before he turned away, with something almost like embarrassment flickering across his ruined features. It was during one of her explorations of the castle's forgotten corners that she discovered the library, a vast and glorious room tucked behind a door swollen with moisture and neglect, its shelves reaching toward a ceiling lost in shadow, its treasures thousands upon thousands of volumes bound in leather and gilt, languishing beneath years of accumulated dust, and the particular sadness of beautiful things abandoned. She could not leave them thus, could not walk past that door each day, knowing what lay beyond in such a state of sorrow, and so she began the work of restoration without asking permission, reasoning that a housekeeper surely had authority over such matters, and that if Sebastian wished to object, He knew well enough where to find her. Days turned into a week as she labored among the stacks, cataloguing and cleaning, rescuing water-damaged volumes, and arranging the survivors according to a system that pleased her orderly mind. And it was on the 8th night of this self-appointed task that she looked up from a particularly beautiful edition of romantic poetry to find Sebastian standing in the doorway, his tall frame haloed by the candlelight from the corridor behind him, watching her with an expression she could not immediately decipher. "You've been busy," he said, and there was something in his voice she had not heard before, not warmth, precisely, but an absence of the cold that usually armored every word. "I used to spend hours in this room, before." He moved into the library with the hesitant gait of a man entering sacred ground from which he had long exiled himself, his fingers trailing along the spines of books as though greeting old friends he had thought never to see again. And Eleonora held very still, barely breathing, afraid that any movement might shatter this unprecedented moment of something approaching connection. "The Waverley novels were my particular favorites," he continued, pulling a volume from the shelf she had organized just that afternoon. "I read them too." He stopped, the familiar shuttering beginning to close over his features, but Eleonora spoke before the walls could fully rise again. "Read them? To whom?" She asked it gently, without demand, an offering rather than an extraction, and perhaps it was the softness of her voice, or the late hour, or the magic that sometimes lives in rooms full of books, but Sebastian Vane answered her with something approaching honesty. "To my daughter, Catherine. She loved the adventure, the romance, the notion that good might triumph, even when all seemed lost." He replaced the book carefully, precisely, and when he looked at her, Eleonora saw behind the scars to the man who had once read bedtime stories to a little girl who would never grow old, and she understood that the beast she had feared was nothing more than grief given form, loneliness wearing armor, a heart that had not died in that fire, but had merely forgotten how to beat for anything but sorrow. The news arrived on a morning grey with impending rain, carried by Thomas, who had ventured to the village for supplies and returned with a face pale as winter frost, his weathered hands trembling as he sought audience with the master he had served for nearly 2 decades, through tragedy and isolation and all the long years between. Eleonora was in the library when she heard the urgent footsteps in the corridor, the low murmur of voices that carried a weight of alarm she could feel in her very bones, and she set aside the volume she had been cataloguing, a collection of sonnets whose pages had yellowed with age and neglect, and moved silently toward the half-open door, driven by an instinct that whispered her fate was being discussed in tones not meant for her ears. "Lord Blackmore has been making inquiries," Thomas was saying, his voice hushed but urgent. "In every village, within 20 miles, showing a miniature portrait of a young woman with dark hair, and asking after any strangers who might have passed through on the night of the great storm. He offers gold for information, Your Grace, enough gold to make honest men forget their honesty." Eleonora felt the blood drain from her face, felt her heart stutter, and then race with the particular terror of prey that has been granted a reprieve, only to hear the hunters approaching once more, and she gripped the doorframe with fingers gone suddenly cold as Sebastian's response cut through the shadows. "Then we ensure there is nothing for them to find." What followed was a transformation that Eleonora watched with wonder and no small measure of fear, for the withdrawn, grief-haunted man who had shared his library and his memories with her vanished entirely, replaced by something harder, sharper, a creature of command and controlled fury that moved through his domain, issuing orders with the precision of a general preparing for siege. The gates were reinforced, the rarely used guardhouse staffed with men summoned from tenant farms, whose families had served the Vane Dukes for generations, and whose loyalty ran deeper than any gold Blackmore might offer. Windows that faced the main road were shuttered. Paths through the surrounding woods were blocked with fallen timber, arranged to appear natural, and Thornwood Castle drew in upon itself like a creature retreating into its shell, bristling with protective intent. "You will remain within the castle walls," Sebastian informed her that evening, his tone brooking no argument. "You will not approach the windows. You will not venture into the gardens. You will not exist for anyone beyond these walls until this threat has passed." And Eleonora, who had bristled at every restriction he had placed upon her, who had fought for her dignity and her right to be treated as a living woman rather than a ghost or a prisoner, found that she could not summon any objection to these new constraints, because she understood, with a clarity that struck her like lightning, that Sebastian was not imprisoning her but rather standing between her and the true monster, the civilized gentleman with his cold eyes and possessive hands, who had made her wedding night a thing of such terror that fleeing into a storm had seemed the kinder fate. Asterisk. How strange asterisk, she thought, watching Sebastian stride through the great hall with purpose burning in his mismatched eyes. Asterisk, that I should feel safer with the beast than I ever did with the man society deemed suitable to be my husband. Asterisk. The injury came 3 days into the siege of waiting, 3 days of shuttered windows and hushed voices, and the particular tension that settles over a household braced for a blow that has not yet fallen, and Eleonora learned of it not from Sebastian himself, who would sooner have bled quietly in some forgotten corner than admit to any weakness, but from Mrs. Finch, who appeared at the library door with her lined face creased in worry and her hands twisted in her apron as she explained that the master had torn his palm open on a rusted nail while reinforcing the eastern gate and was now refusing all assistance with the stubborn pride of a man who had forgotten how to accept kindness from any living soul. Eleonora found him in his study, attempting with singular futility to wrap his own wound, using only his teeth and his uninjured hand, blood seeping through the inadequate bandage he had fashioned from what appeared to be a torn strip of his own shirt. And the sight of him, this fierce, proud, impossible man, reduced to such a state by his own refusal to be cared for, stirred something in her chest that felt dangerously close to tenderness. "You are making a disaster of that," she said from the doorway, and before he could protest or command her away, she had crossed the room and taken his hand in hers, her fingers gentle but firm, as she unwrapped his clumsy efforts and examined the wound beneath a deep gash across his palm, still bleeding sluggishly, the skin around it angry and raw. "I do not require," he began, but she silenced him with a look that had quelled lesser men than the beast of Thornwood, and perhaps it was the surprise of being managed so efficiently, or perhaps the blood loss had weakened his defenses, but Sebastian Vane fell silent and allowed her to tend him with hands that did not tremble, that did not flinch when they touched the scarred terrain of his skin, that moved with a compassion he had not known in so many years that he had forgotten such gentleness existed in the world. She cleaned the wound with water Mrs. Finch had brought, applied a salve that smelled of herbs and healing, wrapped the bandage with careful precision, and throughout it all, Sebastian watched her face, watched for the disgust that must surely come when her soft fingers encountered the ridged and twisted flesh that covered so much of him, watched for the pity that would be somehow worse than revulsion. But Eleonora's expression held neither, only a focused concentration and something else, something warm and steady that he could not name because he had not seen it directed at himself in longer than he could remember. When she finished, she did not immediately release his hand, and their eyes met across the small distance between them, her dark gaze holding his mismatched one without fear or hesitation, and in that suspended moment, something shifted in the air between them, a recognition, perhaps, or a permission, or simply the acknowledgement that whatever existed within these walls had become something more than an arrangement between captor and captive, something that neither of them had words for yet, but both could feel growing like spring beneath winter's final frost. "Thank you," Sebastian said quietly, and the words seemed to cost him something, seemed to open a door he had kept barred for years, and Eleonora simply nodded and released his hand at last, though her fingers lingered for just a moment longer than necessary, a touch that said more than either of them was prepared to speak aloud. The East Tower called to her in dreams before she ever found the courage to answer its summons, whispered to her in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the castle settled into its bones and creaked with secrets it longed to share. And though Eleonora had honored Sebastian's prohibition for weeks through the threat of Blackmore and the intimacy of wound-tending, and all the small moments that had begun to weave themselves into something she dared not name, she found that curiosity had become a living thing inside her, growing stronger with each day that passed in this house of shrouded portraits and covered mirrors, and rooms sealed against memory like tombs against the living. It was a night of restless wakefulness that finally drove her from her bed, her feet carrying her through corridors she had come to know by heart, until she stood before the door she had been forbidden to open. And perhaps it was the way Sebastian had looked at her when she tended his wound, or perhaps it was simply that she could no longer bear to love a mystery without understanding its source times love, asterisk, she thought, and the word startled her even as her hand found the door handle. But whatever the reason, she turned the iron latch and stepped across the threshold into a darkness that smelled of ash and grief and years of accumulated sorrow. The east tower had not been touched since the fire. That much was immediately clear. The walls still bore the black tongues of flame that had licked their way up from below. The ceiling was open in places to the night sky, where the roof had collapsed and never been repaired. And everywhere, were the remnants of a life that had been interrupted in the most brutal fashion imaginable. A nursery, Eleanora realized, as her candle illuminated the space. A nursery that had once been decorated with paper flowers and painted birds, where a small bed still stood with its coverlet half-burned, and a regiment of tin soldiers melted into grotesque shapes upon a shelf. And in the corner, a rocking horse whose mane had been singed to stubble stood eternally frozen in a gallop toward safety it would never reach. But it was the portraits that undid her. The portraits that had been moved here from somewhere safer, perhaps to preserve them, or perhaps because Sebastian could not bear to have them elsewhere in the castle, where he might encounter them unexpectedly. And Eleanora raised her candle to illuminate them with a hand that trembled and a heart that ached with understanding that arrived too late to be. Anything but devastating. There was Sebastian as he had been before the fire, whole and handsome with laughing eyes unclouded by grief, and beside him a woman of gentle beauty whose dark hair and kind face spoke of warmth and grace, and between them a child of perhaps 4 years with her father's mismatched eyes and her mother's smile, a little girl captured in oil paint at the moment of perfect happiness, never knowing that the flames were already being kindled in her future. Asterisk, this is what he lost, asterisk, Eleanora thought as tears traced silent paths down her cheeks. Asterisk, this is the life that was stolen from him, the family that turned to ash while he survived to carry the weight of their absence, asterisk, and she understood at last that Sebastian Vane had not become a beast. He had simply forgotten how to be anything else after love had been so cruelly taken from him. She heard him before she saw him, the uneven rhythm of his footsteps on the tower stairs, and Eleanora did not turn to face him because she could not bear to see rage replace the softness that had begun to grow between them, could not bear to watch him become the beast again when she had so recently glimpsed the man. But the explosion of anger she braced herself against never came, and when she finally found the courage to look upon him, what she saw undid her more completely than any fury ever could have, for Sebastian Vane stood in the doorway of his daughter's ruined nursery, with moonlight streaming through the broken roof to illuminate the devastation of his features, and he was weeping, tears carving silver paths down the scarred and unscarred halves of his face alike, his whole body trembling with a grief so vast and so long suppressed that its emergence seemed to be tearing him apart from within. "I was in London," he said, and his voice was nothing like the commanding tone she had come to know, was instead broken and raw, and barely above a whisper. "Attending to business that seemed so important at the time, business I cannot even remember now, because how could anything matter? How could anything ever matter compared to what I lost while I was counting coins and signing papers and sleeping in a comfortable hotel, while my wife and daughter—" His voice shattered on the word, and he sagged against the doorframe, as though his bones had turned to water. This towering man reduced by memory to something fragile and guttering like a candle flame in a draught. And Eleanora moved toward him without conscious decision, drawn by a compassion that overwhelmed every other consideration, her hand finding his arm and feeling the tremors that ran through him as he continued to speak, the words that had been locked inside him for so long that they emerged jagged and desperate. "I saw the smoke from miles away," he whispered. "I rode until my horse nearly collapsed beneath me, and when I arrived, there was nothing left, nothing but flames and screaming and servants who tried to hold me back as I ran into the inferno searching for them, and I found, he could not finish, could not give voice to what he had discovered in those flames. But Eleanora understood that the scars he wore were not the marks of a survivor who had escaped, but of a father and husband who had tried to follow his family into death and been denied even that mercy, and she did something then that would have been unthinkable. Mere weeks ago she wrapped her arms around Sebastian Vane and held him as he wept, held him as years of frozen grief finally thawed and poured out of him in great racking sobs that shook them both, held him beneath the broken roof of his daughter's nursery with the stars bearing witness to his confession and her comfort. "It should have been me," He breathed against her hair. It should have been me instead of them, and every day since I have lived with the knowledge that I failed them, that I was not there when they needed me most, that I survived when they did not. And Eleonora pulled back, just enough to cup his ruined face in her gentle hands and look into his eyes with a fierce tenderness that permitted no argument. "You are not a beast," she told him, her voice steady despite the tears on her own cheeks. "You are a man who has been drowning in grief. So long you have forgotten what it feels like to breathe." And Sebastian, she spoke his name for the first time, felt the shudder that ran through him at its sound. It is not a betrayal of their memory to survive. It is not a sin to still be alive. And perhaps it is time to stop punishing yourself for a fire you did not start and could not have prevented. The gardens had been dead so long that no one remembered what colors they had once displayed, what fragrances had drifted through open windows on summer afternoons, what paths had wound between flower beds where a little girl might have chased butterflies or picked bouquets for her mother's table. But Eleonora remembered the sketch she had discovered in the library, a watercolor rendering of Thornwood in its glory days, with roses climbing the walls and lavender borders, and a fountain at the center of a circular garden that now held only stagnant water and dead leaves. And it was this sketch she brought to Sebastian, one morning after the night in the tower, had changed everything between them. This vision of what had been, that she offered as a map toward what might yet be again. "I would like to restore the gardens," she said, and watched his face carefully for signs of the withdrawal she had come to recognize, the way he retreated behind his walls when the world threatened to demand something of him that felt like hope. But instead, she saw something flicker in his mismatched eyes, surprise, perhaps, or the first stirring of interest he had permitted himself in years. And when he asked why she would wish to pour effort into dead ground, she answered simply that dead things could grow again if someone had the patience to tend them, and she did not say aloud that she was speaking of more than gardens, though from the way his breath caught she suspected he understood. They began the next day, Eleonora and Sebastian and old Thomas, who wept openly at seeing his master with dirt beneath his fingernails for the first time since the fire, and the work was back-breaking and slow soil that had compacted into something like stone, roots that had died and rotted and left caverns beneath the earth, weeds that had claimed every inch of ground that had once been cultivated with care. But there was something healing in the labor, something sacred in the act of clearing away the dead to make room for the living, and as the days passed, and their hands grew calloused, and the first beds began to emerge from the chaos, Eleonora noticed that Sebastian spoke more freely when he was working, as though the physical exertion loosened something in his chest that conversation alone could never reach. He told her about the rose garden his wife had loved, how she had spent hours selecting varieties and planning color arrangements, and how she had laughed at him when he confused the damask roses with the gallicas, and for the first time the memory did not seem to wound him, but rather warmed him, a candle flame rather than a conflagration. And Eleonora understood that this was how grief transformed when it was finally allowed to breathe, not disappearing but changing, becoming something that could be held without burning, something that honored the dead while still permitting the living to continue. Mrs. Finch began leaving seedlings on the kitchen doorstep, offerings from the village, she claimed, though they all knew she had sent Thomas to purchase them, and slowly, impossibly, the dead gardens of Thornwood began to show signs of life, green shoots pushing through dark earth like promises. And Sebastian smiled for the first time since Eleonora had known him, a small expression that transformed his scarred face into something approaching beautiful, rare and precious as the first crocuses of spring breaking through snow that everyone had assumed would last forever. The ballroom had been sealed for 7 years, its doors locked and its windows shrouded, but Eleonora had discovered the key among a ring of others that Mrs. Finch had entrusted to her care, and on an afternoon when golden autumn light slanted through the castle's western windows, she found herself drawn to the forbidden space by a curiosity that had become, over these months, indistinguishable from hope, and when she pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside, she gasped at what she found. For the ballroom was a cathedral of dust and memory, motes swirling in the amber light like countless tiny ghosts dancing to music only they could hear, chandeliers draped in white cloth, hanging like cocoons, waiting for a metamorphosis that had never come, and at the far end of the vast space, a grand piano sat uncovered, as though someone had been playing it only yesterday, and might return at any moment to continue the interrupted melody. She crossed the dusty floor, leaving footprints in her wake, her fingers trailing along the piano's surface to reveal gleaming ebony beneath the grey film, and when she sat upon the bench and lifted the cover from the keys, she found them yellowed but intact. Waiting, and almost without conscious thought, her hands began to move across them, coaxing forth a lullaby her own mother had sung to her in childhood, a simple melody that seemed to fill the abandoned space with something that felt remarkably like life returning to a body long thought dead. She did not hear Sebastian enter, did not know he was there until the music had drawn her so deeply into its current that the world beyond the piano had ceased to exist. And when she finally sensed his presence and her hands stilled upon the keys, she turned to find him standing in the doorway with an expression she had never seen. Upon his scarred features, not grief exactly, though grief was there, but something more complex, something that contained grief, the way the sea contains salt, present in every part but not the whole of it, and in his eyes she saw the glimmer of tears that he did not allow to fall. "That was her favorite," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion but not broken by it, not shattered the way it had been in the tower, and Eleonora understood that something had shifted in him, that the grief he carried had begun to change its shape from a weight that crushed to a current that carried. "Your daughters?" she asked softly, and he nodded, moving into the room with steps that stirred the dust into fresh spirals of dancing light, and when he reached the piano he did not retreat, but rather extended his scarred hand toward her in a gesture so unexpected that for a moment she simply stared at it without comprehension. "Dance with me," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something precious, seemed to require a courage that facing any physical danger could never have demanded. "I have not danced since before the fire. I have not wanted to, but I find that I want to now, with you, if you would permit a monster such a liberty," and Eleonora silenced him by placing her hand in his, rising from the bench to face him in that cathedral of dust and dying sunlight, and when his arm encircled her waist and they began to move together in a waltz that had no music save the rhythm of their own breathing, she understood that this was not an ending, but a beginning, not a farewell to what had been, but a first tentative step toward what might yet be, two broken souls, finding in each other the missing pieces that made movement possible again, dancing among the ghosts until the ghosts themselves seemed to smile and fade, leaving only the living behind to continue the dance. The idea came to Sebastian in the quiet hours before dawn, an impulse so foreign to the man he had become that at first he did not recognize it for what it was desire, not for solitude or shadow, but for something bright and ordinary, something he had denied himself for 7 years, believing he no longer deserved the simple pleasures that other men took for granted. And when he proposed the venture to Eleonora over breakfast, speaking casually as though suggesting nothing more significant than a walk in the gardens, he watched her face transform with a wonder that made his scarred heart clench with something dangerously close to joy, for he had offered to take her to the village fair, disguised and careful. One afternoon of freedom in a world beyond Thornwood's walls. They departed at midday with Sebastian wrapped in a heavy cloak, his hood drawn low and a mask covering the worst of his scars, a merchant's disguise, he explained, for a man who valued his privacy, and Eleonora wore a simple country dress borrowed from Mrs. Finch's younger days, her hair braided and her bearing transformed from lady to farmer's daughter, and as they walked the hidden path through the forest toward the distant sounds of music and laughter, Eleonora felt something effervescent rising in her chest that she eventually identified as happiness, pure and uncomplicated in a way she had not experienced since childhood. The fair was a riot of color and noise and life, villagers in their finest homespun crowding around stalls, selling everything from meat pies to ribbons to carved wooden toys, and Sebastian moved through the crowd with a tension that gradually softened as he realized that no one looked at him with recognition or horror, that in this disguise he was simply another man among many, unremarkable and blessedly invisible. And when Eleonora tugged him toward a game where one could win prizes by throwing rings over bottlenecks, he found himself laughing at her determined expression as she failed spectacularly at her first 3 attempts. "Let me," he said, and she surrendered the rings with exaggerated defeat, watching as his steady hands that had rebuilt gates and turned soil, and held her while they danced, sent ring after ring, sailing perfectly over the bottles, until the stall-keeper gaped in amazement and offered him any prize he wished, and Sebastian chose the most ridiculous item available, a stuffed rabbit with mismatched button eyes and lopsided ears that made Eleonora dissolve into laughter so genuine that he thought he might live 100 years on the memory of that sound alone. In return, she dragged him to a soap seller's stall and insisted on smelling every variety until she found the lavender she loved, and when she reached for her small purse, Sebastian stopped her hand with his own and purchased the soap himself, pressing it into her palm with a gravity that seemed disproportionate to such a small gift, until she understood that for him this was not merely soap, but a declaration, an admission that he had begun to think of her comfort and her pleasure as things that mattered to him, things worth the risk of venturing into a world he had sworn never to face again. And as they walked home through the lengthening shadows, with her ridiculous rabbit and her lavender soap, and their hearts lighter than either had believed possible, Eleonora understood that something fundamental had shifted between them, that the beast and his prisoner had become something else entirely, something that felt remarkably like the beginning of love. The happiness of that golden afternoon haunted Eleonora in the days that followed, not because it faded, but because it grew, taking root in her heart like the flowers she and Sebastian had coaxed from Thornwood's long-dead gardens, and she found herself watching him with new eyes as autumn deepened into early winter, noticing the way his scarred face softened when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his hand sometimes reached toward her before he remembered himself, and pulled back, the way he had begun to hum her mother's lullaby while working in the gardens, as though the melody had become as essential to him as breathing. And it was in this state of quiet, blooming hope that catastrophe found them, arriving not with the dramatic thunder of the storm that had first driven her to Thornwood's gates, but with the mundane clatter of hooves on the gravel drive and the harsh voices of men who had come to reclaim what they considered their property. Sebastian found her in the library where she had been reading by the fire, and the expression on his face, that terrible blankness that she had not seen since their earliest days together, told her everything before he spoke a single word. And when he said, "Blackmore is at the gates," she felt the blood drain from her face, and her hands begin to tremble with a fear she had almost forgotten, for in these months of sanctuary she had allowed herself to believe that she was safe, that the nightmare of her almost marriage had been left behind forever in that rain-soaked chapel. But nightmares, she understood now, did not surrender their prey so easily. They watched from the darkened window of Sebastian's study as Lord Blackmore dismounted from his horse and approached the gates, flanked by half a dozen armed men whose presence spoke clearly of his intentions, and Eleonora saw for the first time the man she had nearly married, elderly. Yes, but with a cruel vitality in his bearing, a predator's patience in the way he surveyed the castle's walls, as though calculating exactly how to breach them, and when he called out Sebastian's name she realized with horror that her presence here had been discovered, that somehow word of the fair or some careless moment had led this monster directly to the beast who had given her shelter. "I know you're in there, Duke Vane." Blackmore's voice carried across the cold air with the oily confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "I know you've been hiding my bride these many months, and I've come to collect her. Open these gates, or I shall return with the magistrate and a warrant. I shall expose your pathetic hermitage to all the world. I shall see you dragged from this mausoleum and ruined utterly, unless you surrender what belongs to me." Sebastian's hand found Eleonora's in the darkness, his grip fierce and protective, and when he spoke his voice was the growl of the beast she had once feared but now understood. "You will not have her. She is under my protection, and Thornwood does not yield to threats from men who must purchase their brides because no woman would willingly endure their touch." But even as he defied Blackmore, Eleonora saw the calculation in his eyes, the terrible arithmetic of a man weighing his own exposure against her safety, and she understood that the sanctuary she had found was crumbling, that the walls of their fragile paradise were about to come tumbling down around them both. The decision came to Eleonora in the hollow hours of that sleepless night, crystallizing with terrible clarity as she lay in her bed listening to Sebastian pace the floors below, his footsteps a restless rhythm of worry and calculation that broke her heart, because she knew with the certainty of one who has finally allowed herself to love that she could not be the instrument of his destruction, could not watch the world he had so carefully constructed crumble, simply because she had stumbled through his gate seeking shelter from her own storm. And so she rose before dawn, with her mind set upon the only course of action that her conscience would allow. The sacrifice that love demanded, even as it tore her soul in two. She wrote the letter by candlelight, her hand trembling as she committed to paper the words she had never spoken aloud, confessing in ink what she had been too afraid to confess in breath, that somewhere between their silent dinners and their battles in the library and their dance among the dust motes, she had fallen impossibly and irrevocably in love with him, with the beast who had become her sanctuary, with the broken man who had taught her that true monsters wore pleasant faces and spoke honeyed words, while their eyes calculated your worth in pounds and property, and that it was precisely because of this love that she must leave him, must surrender herself to Blackmore's claim, rather than watch Sebastian dragged from his refuge and exposed to a world that would see only his scars and never the magnificent soul beneath them. "You have given me more happiness in these few months than I have known in all my years," she wrote, her tears falling onto the page and blurring the words she hoped he would somehow understand. "And I cannot repay that gift by becoming the architect of your ruin. You deserve peace, Sebastian. You deserve the quiet life you have built from the ashes of your grief. And if my leaving can purchase that peace, then I shall walk through those gates without regret, knowing that somewhere behind me you remain safe and whole, and perhaps, in time, capable of finding the happiness you have taught me to believe in again." She placed the letter on his desk, where he would find it when he came searching for her, and then she walked through the sleeping castle one final time, her fingers trailing across the spines of the books she had organized, across the keys of the piano where they had danced, across the doorframe of the kitchen where Mrs. Finch had taught her to make bread and told her stories of the boy Sebastian had been, before fire and grief had forged him into something harder. And when she finally reached the great doors and stepped out into the grey dawn light, she did not allow herself to look back, for she knew that if she saw Thornwood's towers against the lightning sky, she would lose her courage and remaining would doom the man she loved to the very exposure he had spent 7 years avoiding. But what Eleanora did not know, could not have known, was that Sebastian had not slept at all that night, that he had gone to her door a dozen times only to turn away, and that when he finally entered his study and found her letter, a sound emerged from his throat that was neither human nor beast, but something rawer still, and he was running before he had finished reading, running through corridors and gardens and across frost-bitten ground toward the gates where he could already see her small figure approaching, walking toward a fate worse than death, with her shoulders set in the posture of someone who believed her sacrifice was the purest form of love. Sebastian's voice tore through the grey morning air like thunder. Her name, a desperate incantation that froze Eleanora mid-stride, just paces from where Blackmore waited, beyond the iron gates, with his cruel smile and his armed men, and she turned to see him running toward her across the frost-whitened ground, her letter clutched in his scarred hand, his face a landscape of anguish and fury, and something else entirely, something that looked like the terrible dawning of a man who has just discovered that he possesses something worth losing. And before she could speak, before she could explain that she was doing this for him, he had reached her and pulled her behind him with a gentleness that belied the violence coiling in every line of his body, positioning himself between her and the gates like a shield forged from grief and love, and the desperate courage of a man who has finally found something to fight for. "You do not get to sacrifice yourself for me," he growled, his voice low and fierce as he gripped her hand. "You do not get to walk away believing you are worth less than my comfort, worth less than this hiding, worth less than the shadows I have wrapped around myself like a shroud I have lost. Everything once, Eleanora, and I will not stand idle while you march toward destruction, wearing my salvation like chains around your wrists." And then he did the unthinkable. He walked toward the gates, toward Blackmore and his witnesses, and the world he had hidden from for 7 years, and with each step the morning light fell more fully upon his face, illuminating every ridge and valley of ruined flesh, every testament to the fire that had taken everything from him. And when he reached the iron bars, he did not flinch, did not turn away, but stood in full view of the men who gasped and whispered at the sight of him, the legendary beast of Thornwood made manifest at last. "Look upon me, Blackmore," Sebastian commanded, his voice carrying the authority of his title and something more, something ancient and unyielding. "Look upon the monster you have come to challenge and understand. This Lady Eleanora Ashford is under my protection. She has claimed sanctuary within my walls, and I will see you destroyed utterly before I allow you to lay a single finger upon her. I will burn my own reputation to ashes and dance upon the embers, if that is what it takes to keep her safe from a creature like you. For you speak of beasts and monsters, but I see the truth of what you are, the rot beneath your pleasant face, the cruelty you hide behind civilization's mask." Blackmore's composure flickered, something like fear crossing his features as he beheld Sebastian in his full, terrible glory. This scarred duke, who had stepped from legend into reality, with fire in his eyes and a woman's hand clutched in his own, and Eleonora watched as the man she loved shed 7 years of hiding in a single moment, choosing exposure over her sacrifice, choosing her over the safety of his shadows. And she understood then that love was not always gentle, that sometimes it roared and fought and revealed itself to the world regardless of consequence, that Sebastian had become something more than beast or man. He had become hers, wholly and irrevocably, and he would not let her go without a battle. The silence that followed Sebastian's declaration stretched taut as a bowstring, every witness holding their breath as Blackmore's face cycled through shock and fury and something that looked almost like calculation, his mind clearly working to find advantage even in this moment of exposure. But Sebastian was not finished. He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather folder, its contents the fruit of weeks of quiet investigation, letters and ledgers and testimonies gathered by Thomas during his visits to the village, by contacts Sebastian had maintained even in his isolation, by the network of information that a duke, even a hidden one, could still command when sufficiently motivated. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the cold precision of a man who has prepared for battle. "You speak of claims and rights, Blackmore. You invoke the law as though it were your ally. But let us examine what the law would truly make of you. Here I hold evidence of debts totaling more than your estate could pay in 3 lifetimes, gambling markers from London's most disreputable establishments, letters from creditors threatening legal action, and most damning of all, sworn statements from servants in your household detailing the mysterious disappearance of your previous wife, the convenient accident that left you a widower with access to her fortune, an accident that 3 separate witnesses are prepared to describe as something far more sinister than the riding mishap your physician so obligingly recorded." Blackmore's face, drained of color, his cultivated composure cracking like ice beneath a sudden thaw, and the men behind him shifted uneasily, their loyalty clearly wavering as they beheld not a wronged nobleman seeking his wayward bride, but a cornered predator whose true nature was being dragged into the unforgiving light of morning. "You have 2 choices," Sebastian continued, each word falling like a stone into still water. "You will sign this document relinquishing all claim to Lady Eleonora Ashford, declaring the engagement dissolved by mutual agreement, and then you will disappear from this county, from this country if you possess any wisdom at all, and you will never speak her name again, or I will ensure that every magistrate, every newspaper, every drawing room from here to London receives copies of these documents, and you will spend what remains of your miserable existence fleeing creditors and dodging constables, and wondering when the hangman's noose will finally find your neck for the murder we both know you committed." The moment hung suspended in the grey morning air, frost glittering on the iron gates like scattered diamonds, and Eleonora watched as Blackmore's hand trembled when he reached for the pen. Sebastian offered through the bars, watched as he signed his name with the jerky movements of a man who has finally encountered a monster greater than himself, watched as the document that had bound her to a nightmare was replaced by one that set her free, and when Blackmore turned and fled with his men following in shameful retreat, she felt something break loose in her chest, not her heart, for that had already been given, but the chains of fear she had worn so long she had forgotten their weight, and she was free, truly and legally and completely free, standing in the dawn light beside the beast who had become her champion, the scarred duke, who had sacrificed his precious anonymity to save her from a fate she had nearly walked toward willingly. And she understood then that some cages were opened not with keys but with courage, and some monsters were vanquished not with swords but with truth. The sound of retreating hoofbeats faded into the morning mist, carrying with them the last vestiges of the nightmare that had pursued Eleonora across counties and through storms to this moment, and in the silence that followed, she became acutely aware that she and Sebastian stood alone at the gates of Thornwood, the world he had hidden from now, knowing his face, his scars, his existence, and yet he seemed not to care, his attention fixed wholly upon her with an intensity that made her breath catch, his scarred hand still holding hers, as though he feared she might yet attempt to vanish like morning fog beneath the rising sun. And when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion, long suppressed, trembling with the weight of confession. "There is something I must tell you, something I should have confessed months ago but could not find the courage, could not bear the thought of watching you walk away once you knew the truth. Eleonora, the rule that bound you here, the decree that those who enter Thornwood do not leave, I released you from it the night you tended my wounded hand, the night you touched my scars without flinching and looked at me as though I were still a man. I could not keep you caged after that, could not pretend that my walls had not already begun to crumble, but I was too much a coward to tell you, too terrified that freedom would mean losing you. And so I remained silent while you stayed, believing yourself a prisoner, when in truth the only chains were my own desperate, selfish hope that you might choose to remain." The confession hung between them like incense smoke, fragrant with vulnerability, and Eleonora felt tears gather in her eyes, not of betrayal but of wonder, of tenderness for this man who had given her freedom in secret while praying she would not use it, who had loved her in silence while believing himself unworthy of love in return. And she reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the familiar landscape of his scars with the reverence of one mapping sacred ground. "Sebastian," she whispered, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her, "I stopped wanting to leave the morning I found you reading in the library, your face soft with something like peace, and I realized that this prison had become my sanctuary, that the beast I had feared had become the only safety I had ever known. I stayed not because I believed myself trapped, but because there was nowhere else I wished to be, no other company I craved, no other voice I longed to hear across the dinner table, no other presence I sought in the quiet hours of evening. And if you had told me the gates were open, I would have walked not through them but away from them, deeper into Thornwood, deeper into whatever life you would share with me." She pressed her palm against his chest, feeling the thundering of his heart beneath her touch. "You are worthy of love, Sebastian Vane, not despite your scars, but wholly, completely, as you are. And I see not a beast when I look upon you, but a man of courage and grief and tenderness, a man who has suffered and survived, and somehow found it within himself to love again, and I would be honored beyond measure to spend whatever years remain to me, proving to you what I have known for months now, that you are not the monster of Thornwood but its heart, and you have become the heart of me as well." 3 years had passed since that morning at the gates, 3 years since the beast emerged from his shadows and claimed his bride in the light of day, and Thornwood Castle had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible to the desperate woman who had first stumbled through its gates, seeking shelter from a storm. The heavy curtains that had shrouded every window now hung open to admit rivers of golden sunlight. The portraits that had faced the walls in shame had been turned to watch over rooms filled with warmth and laughter, and the gardens that Eleonora had coaxed back to life now rioted with color in every season, roses climbing the ancient stones, as though determined to soften every harsh edge with petals and perfume. And on this particular afternoon in late summer, Sebastian Vane, Duke of Thornwood, stood at the library window watching his wife chase their daughter through the lavender beds, their laughter carrying across the grounds like music he had once believed he would never hear again within these walls. And he marveled as he did each day at the miracle of this second chance, this undeserved grace that had arrived at his door disguised as a half-drowned runaway bride and proceeded to resurrect not only his gardens but his very soul. Little Charlotte, named for his lost daughter, a name Eleonora had suggested with such tenderness that he had wept when she spoke. It was 3 years old now, with her mother's determined spirit and her father's dark eyes, and she showed no fear of his scars, had never known him as anything other than Papa, who lifted her to pick apples from the highest branches and told her stories of princesses brave enough to befriend beasts. And watching her now, her small hands full of flowers she had picked for the dinner table, Sebastian felt the last frozen places within his heart finally thaw completely, understood at last that grief and joy could coexist, that loving again did not betray those he had lost but honored them, that his first wife and daughter would have wanted this for him: life, love, laughter in halls that had known too much silence. Mrs. Finch emerged onto the terrace with a tray of lemonade, Her aged face creased with the contentment of a woman who had waited years to see her master smile, and Thomas had long since hired additional groundskeepers to help maintain the flourishing estate, the gates now opening regularly to welcome visitors from the village that had once whispered of the beast in fearful tones, but now spoke of the Duke with respect and even affection, for Sebastian had emerged from his isolation not as the monster of legend, but as a benefactor who funded the local school and ensured no family went hungry through winter, his scars fading in significance beside his generosity. Eleonora caught sight of him at the window and waved, her smile radiant with the particular joy of a woman who had found not merely safety but home, who had discovered that the prison she had fled into had become the paradise she had never dared imagine. And as Sebastian descended to join his family in the garden that had first taught them to grow together, he understood the profound truth that had taken him years of darkness to learn, that sanctuary was not a place but a choice, that walls could protect or imprison depending on whether they were built from fear or love, and that the greatest transformation was not of castle or garden, but of the heart that finally found courage enough to open its long-barred gates and let light flood the rooms it had believed were meant for shadows. Dear listener, as the evening shadows lengthen and this tale draws to its close, let us pause together to consider what we have witnessed in the halls of Thornwood Castle, a story that appeared at first to be about beasts and prisons, about scars that mark the flesh and walls that confine the body, but revealed itself in truth to be about something far more profound, about the fortresses we construct around our wounded hearts, and the extraordinary courage required to lower the drawbridge and allow another soul to enter our most guarded spaces. For are we not all, in our own ways, inhabitants of castles we have built from grief and fear and the memory of pain, convinced that isolation is safety and that to be seen truly is to risk devastation beyond bearing? The world would have us believe that monsters are easily identified, that they wear their wickedness upon their faces, that scars and shadows mark the dangerous and the cruel. Yet Eleonora's story teaches us that the true beasts often move through society with pleasant smiles and impeccable manners, that Lord Blackmore, with his unmarked face and respectable reputation, proved infinitely more monstrous than the scarred recluse who offered sanctuary to a desperate stranger. And perhaps this is the first truth we must carry with us from these pages, that beauty and goodness are not synonymous, that the smoothest surface may conceal the darkest depths, and that love, true love, develops vision keen enough to perceive the soul beneath whatever mask of flesh contains it. But there is another truth woven through this tapestry, one that speaks to the Sebastian in each of us, the part that believes our wounds have rendered us unworthy of connection, that our scars, whether visible upon our skin or hidden within our hearts, disqualify us from the warmth we secretly crave. And to this wounded part I say with all the tenderness I can muster, you are not your tragedies, you are not the sum of your sorrows, you are not defined by the fires you have survived or the losses you have endured, and somewhere, perhaps closer than you imagine, there exists a soul brave enough and gentle enough to see past every barrier you have erected and recognize the light that still burns within you, waiting only for permission to illuminate the darkness you have inhabited for so long. Perhaps you, too, have built walls for protection high and thick and bristling with warnings to keep the world at bay, and perhaps those walls have served you well, have given you space to heal, have allowed you to survive seasons that might otherwise have destroyed you. But I ask you now to consider whether the time has come to test the hinges of your gates, to allow them to swing open even slightly, to permit the possibility that sanctuary need not mean solitude, and that protection need not preclude love. May you find someone brave enough to climb your walls, and may you be brave enough to let them in when they arrive. And may you discover, as Sebastian and Eleonora discovered, that the greatest transformation awaits not beyond our prisons but within them, in the miraculous alchemy that occurs when two wounded souls choose each other, choose healing, choose to believe that joy is not a betrayal of grief, but its redemption. Rest well, dear listener, and may morning find your own gates open to possibility.